Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about some missed opportunities. Last week I talked a little bit about how I thought the President had missed the opportunity with his Deficit Commission, he'd missed the opportunity with his State of the Union speech, and he'd missed the opportunity with his budget. Well, almost 2 weeks ago, President Obama scolded Congress for not making enough progress on debt ceiling and budget negotiations. He said we needed to stay in Washington last week and get things done. I took him at his word. I thought the administration and the majority were serious about staying in Washington to push forward and get some results. We were all in Washington last week, but we didn't get anything done. The debt and the deficit and the lack of a budget aren't the only issues facing America. When are we going to have real issues processed through committees that provide real solutions? Despite reports suggesting that Democrats had reached an agreement on a budget deal among themselves, the majority did not present us with that budget. Despite the President's comments that Congress needed to be in session to reach an agreement, he refused to meet with our caucus. We've gone more than 800 days without passing any sort of budget in the Senate. And when we stayed in Washington last week to work on a budget deal, Democrats refused to bring up that budget for a vote. Last week we had an opportunity to make headway on the debt ceiling issue. I spoke on the floor last Wednesday and implored my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in rolling up their sleeves and figuring a way to get this fiscal mess this country is in solved. I laid out the facts and figures, frightening numbers that should have galvanized us all into action. Instead, we're still pushing for a comprehensive solution to the problem, or none at all. This isn't deal or no deal time. Now here we are, and what was supposed to be an important work week has come and gone. What do we have to show for it? We had one vote canceled on the Libya resolution, a substitute vote on whether the Sergeant of Arms could compel attendance, which was a non-budget related matter, and we had one legislative vote on Senator Reid's resolution about tax increases. This resolution is a sense of the Senate, which is not something that can become law. At this juncture, more than ever, we don't need publicity pieces. What we could have done is move forward with the balanced budget amendment that all 47 Republicans have co-sponsored. Or we could have voted on my legislation to reduce spending by 1% each year until we achieve a balanced budget. Or we could have voted on legislation that other Republicans have offered that would cap spending. Or we could have voted on legislation offered by Republicans to ensure we pay our creditors in the event that we cannot reach an agreement on the debt ceiling. Unfortunately, we didn't do any of that, and instead spent a week holding one legislative vote on a sense of the Senate about raising taxes that, even if passed, would not have the force of law. Republicans have proposed a variety of ideas that will help us get out of this fiscal mess we're in. Some are baby steps. Some are giant steps. Every bill doesn't have to be comprehensive. Members of the majority have said Republicans were using every tactic to delay. What was last week? A vote on a sense of the Senate? The House passed a budget in April. In the Senate, Republicans proposed 2 additional budget measures. The only plan presented by the majority, President Obama's budget for fiscal year 2012, was unanimously opposed. That's 0 to 97. Not even a single Democrat voted for the President's budget. Sounds like a different course is needed. I thought we were here to take care of business. Is one legislative vote on an opinion piece considered taking care of business? Not in my mind. I'm willing to bet that the American people don't think so either. This is exactly the kind of behavior that's frustrating people in Wyoming and all across the country. They've asked us to come do a job. They put their faith in us that we'll take care of business and get this country back on solid fiscal footing. The American people want us to thoughtfully and seriously work to address the debt ceiling and reduce spending. Taking one legislative vote in a week doesn't pass the smell test for getting the job done. The work product we gave the American people last week is appalling. We're staring the most predictable crisis in American history in the face. And with only one legislative vote last week, we essentially said it's not dire enough for us to get something done. It's not important enough for us to stop playing political games and stop running the clock. I'm hopeful that this week will be different. I'm hopeful we'll actually make progress on budget negotiations. I'm encouraged that the President has finally taken it upon himself to engage leaders on the matter. His direct engagement should have been happening for months, and his refusal to get directly involved has put us in the situation we're in today, with 3 weeks until the Treasury Department is left without options for the debt ceiling. We've lost time, we've lost opportunities, we've lost the focus started by the Deficit Commission. Every day that passes that we don't get anything done is one more option lost and more money spent on borrowed time and borrowed money. Businesses across the country can't afford to waste a day, much less a week, without productivity. If they did, I guarantee they would pay a heavy price. And if their unproductive behavior continued, they'd have to close their doors. People going to work every day can't afford to sit around and not do their jobs. If Americans and businesses across this country have to work hard and stay productive to provide for their families and keep their businesses running, so should we. The standard shouldn't be any different in the Senate. As for a solution that relies on increased taxes, when Congress fails by spending too much, the easy answer is always to raise taxes. There are many Republican proposals for raising revenue without raising taxes. But we cannot get in a situation where, when we fail, we charge the people more. It usually results in less revenue anyway. The motion we're voting on tonight is a sham. When it passes, we have permission to add amendments to the sense of the Senate resolution, maybe. In other words, we can amend the opinion of the Senate that cannot become law. How long will we amend and debate an opinion? I'm disappointed we didn't get anything done last week. I hope we all learned a lesson from the week we just lost. The issues facing the country today are too important and too dire for us to waste time like we did. I know right now committees are not having real markups, so there's nothing in the drawer to vote on. And even the few times the bill has been brought up, the majority did not want to vote on amendments and shut the process down. That isn't getting us anywhere. We need to change course. The time for action is now, and I hope we can use last week's failure to get things done as an incentive to roll up our sleeves and get to work. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
further proceedings in quorum call be dispensed with,
Without objection.
and that I be allowed to speak for up to 5 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Without my glasses, Mr. President, this might be a little difficult. I wanted to indicate, Mr. President, that today I'm introducing with Senator John McCain Senate Bill 1344, which is a response to Arizona's largest wildfire called the Wallow Fire. And this act is the Wallow Fire Recovery and Monitoring Act. The Wallow Fire in Arizona burned over about 40 days, 538,000 acres of Arizona land, making it the largest fire in the history of our state. And just to put it into perspective, that's nearly 841 square miles, or almost 4 times the size of the city of Chicago. The fire destroyed 32 homes and 4 rental cabins. Nearly 10,000 people were evacuated at one point, and it cost the taxpayers over $100 million before it was finally extinguished. And unfortunately, it will likely cost at least double that amount for the necessary rehabilitation of the forests that needs to occur now. After a fire like this, there's only a short window of opportunity to hasten forest rehabilitation, to reduce the risks of flooding and insect epidemics and future fires, and to capture at least some of the economic benefit from the dead and dying trees to help pay for those restoration costs. Given the urgent need for action, as I said, I am introducing today this Arizona Wallow Fire Recovery and Monitoring Act, joined by my colleague Senator John McCain as an original co-sponsor. This legislation will expedite the removal of hazard, dead, and dying trees in community protection management areas within the Wallow Fire area. The removal projects carried out under the Act would be completed within 18 months of enactment. And the reason for this timeline is that when it comes to timber harvesting of fire-killed trees, the costs of delay are extreme. Fire-killed trees will lose more than 40% of their value in less than 2 years. Due to the intensity, the size, and the magnitude of the fire, there's a tremendous amount of dead and dying trees within the Wallow Fire area. Portions of the forest that have burned pose a risk to forest users, to communities, to private property, and to the remaining resources. And these risks included the hazards of falling trees, erosion and flooding, reburns due to excess fuel loads, and insect infestation risk to the remaining live trees. Under these post-fire conditions, timber salvage is a management tool to mitigate these risks, to generate revenue and jobs, and to put the forest on the road to recovery. We saw the negative consequences of delay firsthand in Arizona after the Rodeo Chetiskyer fire in 2002, which at that point had been our state's largest fire. Bureaucratic regulations and lawsuits so severely delayed salvage efforts that by the time the projects were cleared to proceed, the trees had lost most of their economic value. Congress should not stand by and allow this situation to be repeated. That said, we're not looking to eliminate environmental safeguards or to exempt timber harvest from federal environmental laws. This bill is narrowly tailored, limiting the removal of hazard, dead, and dying trees to those trees located within community protection management areas. One of these areas includes the wildland-urban interface and other developed areas critical to communities. In addition, a comprehensive hazard tree and commercial timber evaluation and an environmental assessment under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, are required. All appeals and judicial review would follow the processes in the Bipartisan Healthy Forest Restoration Act. The practice of post-fire timber salvage may be controversial, in part because there is limited scientific information on its ecological effects. Most of the scientific literature that does exist is based on forests in the Pacific Northwest. The forests in that part of the country, however, are very different from the dry, ponderosa pine-dominated forests that burned in the Wallow Fire. Thus, the bill would require monitoring for all timber removal projects implemented under the Act. Finally, from a fiscal perspective, there is never going to be enough federal funding for the forest restoration work that needs to be done to save the forest that remains. Acknowledging this reality, This bill takes the proceeds from the timber removal project sales and keeps them on this forest to help pay for future forest restoration treatments. This bill strikes a responsible balance between environmental concerns and economics after a catastrophic wildfire. I urge my colleagues to support its swift passage, and, Mr. President, would ask unanimous consent that a brief summary of the bill following the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka?
President,
The senator from Arizona.
before the clerk calls the roll, could I also ask unanimous consent that the time be equally divided during the quorum call?
Without objection.
And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka?
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week, the House Speaker, Speaker Boehner, and President Obama and his administration were both calling for comprehensive tax reform as part of a large budget deal. Now, obviously, today that seems to have lost some momentum, and I just wanted to start this afternoon by saying that tax reform is too important to abandon after 48 hours worth of discussion. And to his credit, Chairman Conrad recognizes that, and certainly that's what I heard this weekend when, like the distinguished President of the Senate, I was home. I had a chance to be across eastern Oregon in small towns, and I think there's a keen awareness that it's not possible to cut our way out of this economic challenge. You also have to grow. You have to grow. You've got to make growth-oriented changes in tax law. And that is what the Conrad budget clearly offers a wide berth to do. And in fact, I'm of the view that pro-growth tax reform, for example, is one of the few ways to generate revenue that both Democrats and Republicans will both support. When you put people to work, and we've got millions and millions of our fellow citizens out of work today, those are folks who can, in the private sector, start paying taxes again. That's what happened after the last major tax reform bill in 1986. In those 2 years, the 2 years after major tax reform, 6.3 million new jobs were created in the private sector. We have an opportunity to do that again, and the Conrad budget offers a wide berth in which to do it. So you generate revenue, revenue that both Democrats and Republicans can support. Create jobs in the private sector the way Democrats and Republicans have said they want to do. And certainly it's pretty clear that as of today, there really isn't anything as promising in the economic toolshed for long-term growth as tax reform. The fact is, a lot of other alternatives have been tried. Certainly the Federal Reserve has done its share. We had the Recovery Act. There have been a variety of steps that have been taken. My colleague from Oregon, in my view, has done yeoman work on the effort to make sure that homeowners, it's an enormous economic problem, have additional time to work through the very challenging situations that millions are facing in the housing market. So we've thrown a lot of economic tools at this huge challenge. But we obviously have a lot more to do, and I don't see any more promising path than tax reform for the long-term economic growth that this country needs, and the Conrad budget offers a wide berth in order to tap that opportunity. The fact is, Mr. President, we understand what needs to be done in terms of tax reform, and the fundamental language, the principles of that kind of reform are laid out in the Conrad budget. We ought to go in there, clean out a score of these special interest tax loopholes, use that money to hold down rates for everybody, and keep progressivity. 3 key principles. And a number of my colleagues have spoken on this. I know my friend from Arizona, with whom I serve on the Finance Committee, Senator Kyl, in a very fine op-ed piece that he wrote in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, talked about tax reform built around exactly those principles, cleaning out the loopholes, holding down the rates, and to his credit, Senator Kyl specifically talked about the need to ensure progressivity in the tax code. Mr. President, Senator Coates and I have introduced legislation that picks up on those key principles of the 1986 tax reform legislation. In fact, we really modernize the code in line with that kind of thinking. Certainly important to do because there have been thousands and thousands of tax changes made since 1986. So it's certainly time to go in there and trim out all those unnecessary special interest tax breaks, and we can do it in a way that will create jobs. For example, right now in the federal tax code, there are actually incentives to export jobs out of the United States. You say that to yourself, export jobs out of the United States. What we want to do is we want to export goods out of the United States. In rural Oregon this weekend, the farmers were telling me about how they want to get their agricultural products into Asia and other markets around the world so we can grow things here, make things here, add value to them here, and ship them somewhere. That's what we'd like to be exporting. Instead, under the tax law, there's actually an incentive to export jobs. You set up shop overseas, and when you're doing business, overseas, you get to defer your American taxes. So what Senator Coates and I seek to do, and this is something that I think is even more important today than it was a quarter century ago because of the global economic challenge, Senator Coates and I take that incentive that now goes for exporting jobs out of the United States and take those very same dollars and use those dollars to dramatically slash rates for companies that offer what I call red, white, and blue jobs, jobs here in this country. And the Conrad budget offers a very substantial berth for taking that kind of approach in tax reform, where he specifically calls for lowering tax rates for American businesses. And I particularly want to see it done because of the message I heard this last weekend, where folks specifically, without my even mentioning tax reform, talked about the need to keep jobs here at home. So, Mr. President, we're going to, over the next few days, see, of course, the negotiations with the President and the congressional leadership go forward. Chairman Conrad and other members of the Budget Committee will be out discussing these issues as well. But I just hope, number one, that the cause of tax reform is seen as far too important to give it up after a 48-hour flurry of interest and everybody then saying, well, I guess we'll have to do it another time. The time to make sure it's done is now. Senator Coates and I said earlier this month what we ought to do, recognizing that you can't write a complete tax reform bill between now and August 2nd, what we ought to do is get a commitment, really lock in a strategy to do comprehensive tax reform in the fall and early next year. That alone would send, in my view, a positive and bipartisan message to the financial markets of this country that there really were going to be some changes. So, Mr. President, what we need is a roadmap for economic growth. There are other features of the Conrad budget that I think make a lot of sense. I'm particularly pleased about the opportunities for investment in infrastructure, roads, and bridges. Certainly, that would provide an opportunity for something that's worked in the past, the Build America Bonds program, which has been so successful in our state. I think Senator Kerry's ideas for an infrastructure bank are excellent ones. I support those as well. The best thing about that approach is that we know that we have to find a way in our consumer-driven society to start stimulating demand for goods and services. There are few economic multipliers in our country for the short term, like transportation. So the Conrad budget that puts a premium on those kinds of approaches in the short term makes a lot of sense for me. As we look to the longer term, which I would really define as the opportunity to set this country on a pro-growth economic strategy with tax reform in the forefront in a way that helps our economy to be both fairer and more efficient. We'll also see a lot of other benefits. Mr. President, it was brought up to me over the weekend at home in eastern Oregon, matters we've talked about before, like the alternative, minimum tax. Talk about something that just defies common sense. The idea that the alternative minimum tax would force middle-class people, people making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, a year, to fill out their taxes twice using two separate systems, just defies any semblance of sanity. So, referring again to what happened, this weekend, are we really going to tell American taxpayers getting clobbered by the alternative minimum tax that after 2 days' worth of discussion about tax reform, we're just going to walk away and pursue some other topic? That doesn't make any sense to me. And certainly Chairman Conrad's budget, which does, as I've indicated, provide a broad berth for tax reform, makes it clear that he shares our view. So finally, if you have in front of you, as we will with pro-growth tax reform, the opportunity to create jobs in the private sector, generate revenue in a way that Democrats and Republicans can agree on, make ourselves more competitive in tough global markets, and do it in a way that brings the political parties together, I think it makes clear that that has the fundamentals of what can take this country's economy in a better and healthier direction. I want it understood, Mr. President, that in spite of what happened this weekend, in spite of this sense that maybe tax reform is going to be put off yet again, I'm not going to give up for a minute. We're going to have another hearing that's going to be very important this week. Chairman Baucus, Chairman Camp, the Finance Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, getting together to talk about tax reform. So we know what needs to be done. Now it's a question of having the political will to go forward. I simply want to say to the President, I think I can say to the Senate today, Senator Coates and I, despite the idea that this is too hard to do, can't be done now, let's put it off for another time, we're going to come back to this floor and say again and again, it's been done. We need to do it now when there are so few other tools in the economic tool shed, and it would be wrong to walk away after this brief flurry of interest in something that is so fundamental to the economic well-being of millions of our people. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to offer an amendment to the underlying bill. This amendment is designed to give American employers some relief from the regulatory burdens that continue to hold back our economy and hinder job creation. This amendment is actually identical to a bill I introduced in April, S. 817, which has been endorsed by both the Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Businesses. It's the same amendment I also introduced on the Small Business Bill, the Economic Development Administration bills, and it's also part of the larger regulatory relief bill I introduced in June, which currently has 22 co-sponsors. Last week, as we know, we heard more troubling economic news. This time it was the June jobs report, which unfortunately showed the unemployment rate had actually risen to 9.2%, and hiring slowed to just 18,000 new jobs. These are, of course, very disappointing numbers, but much more important is about the families who are affected by it, families in my home state of Ohio and across the nation who are struggling to find a job and to get the paycheck they need to make ends meet. The real discussion in Washington this month in particular has been focused on the fiscal reforms, and we need to get our fiscal house in order to get the economy back on track. But there are other things that we can do as well, and one, of course, is to reduce the regulatory burden, particularly on small businesses. I hear from them all the time. I'm sure my colleagues do as well. This burden is increasing. One recent study commissioned by the Small Business Administration put that burden at $1.75 trillion annually. By the way, that's more than the IRS collects in income taxes. I've been encouraged by what the current administration has been saying about these regulations, but I continue to be deeply concerned about the new regulatory costs that this administration is imposing as we meet here today on the private sector. We've seen a sharp uptick over the past 2 years in what's called a major or economically significant rule. These are regulations that have an economic effect of $100 million or more. According to the Office of Management and Budget in the Obama administration and also the GAO, the current administration has been regulating at a pace of 84 of these major rules per year, which, by the way, is a 50% increase over the average regulatory output during the Clinton administration, which had 56 major rules per year. These figures include both the executive branch agencies and the so-called independent agencies. Today, I was pleased to see that President Obama issued a new executive order that specifically addressed independent agencies. These are the regulatory bodies that are not within the executive agencies but are considered independent. They would include the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the newly created Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has been subject to a lot of debate here on the floor. These are all independent agencies which are designed by law to be insulated from presidential control. This new order the President issued today and the accompanying presidential memorandum endorse two goals. First, it asks independent agencies to participate in ongoing regulatory look-backs. That means looking back retrospectively at rules that are already on the books to see whether they make sense. Every administration since President Ronald Reagan has done this, undertaken some kind of a look back, and it's important this work continue. Second, and more importantly in my view, it calls on independent agencies to evaluate the costs and the benefits of new regulations, as executive agencies are already required to do under executive orders, including an executive order by President Clinton and an executive order by President Obama in January. I'm encouraged by the words of this new executive order and presidential memorandum on independent agencies. It endorses a very common-sense principle that independent agencies, no less than executive agencies, should evaluate the costs of new regulations before imposing a new burden on the economy. It's common sense. It's also consistent with these amendments that I've been offering on legislation this year and the independent agency part of the regulatory relief bill that I introduced in June. The problem is that the President's order today is entirely non-binding because independent agencies don't answer to the President. So it has no force of law. The amendment I'm offering today would effectively write the President's new request into law. So the President has now agreed with this principle. We need to expand this cost-benefit analysis to independent agencies, but we need legislation in order to do it because these independent agencies are not answerable to the President. Specifically, this amendment would extend the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation where I was the Republican co-sponsor in the House, and it expands it to independent agencies. Major rules issued by what's sometimes called the headless fourth branch of government are today exempt not only from the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, but also from the cost-benefit review overseen by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, at the Office of Management and Budget. So this amendment would change that, effectively making the President's order that he issued today binding on these independent agencies. They'd be required under the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act to evaluate regulatory costs, benefits, and less costly alternatives before issuing any rule that would impose a cost of $100 million or more on the private sector or on state, local, tribal governments. Based on the GAO data, it appears that there are nearly 200 independent agency regulations that have been issued between 1996 and 2011. It would be considered major, in other words, have over a $100 million impact on the economy. And they were excluded, again, from review under this cost-benefit analysis we've been talking about. In 2009 and 2010 alone, the last couple of years, independent agencies issued 56 economically significant regulations, representing billions of dollars in regulatory costs, exempt from the standard cost-benefit analysis rules. But this affects our economy in big ways, affects jobs and our ability to get this economy back on track. Closing this independent agency loophole is a reform that those of us on both sides of the aisle should join the President in supporting. This is the right vehicle to be able to achieve that. No major regulation, whatever its source, should be imposed on American employers or on state and local governments without a serious consideration of what the costs are, what the benefits are, and whether there is available a less burdensome alternative to achieve the same objective. This amendment moves us closer toward that goal. It's a common-sense amendment, again, taking the President's executive order and memorandum of today and actually putting it into force through the force of law. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence